I'll just start. So let's talk a little bit about the teaching the art of science communication. We'll address the following questions. So first of all, what are we trying to teach in science communication training? How should we organize science communication training once we decided what we want to teach? How do we know if we succeeded in teaching whatever we decided to teach? Is science communication training effective at all? And can we teach science communication using a massive online course? Of course, what I'm going to tell about is not only my work. So the work I'm going to tell about of what to teach and in what order were done with Professor Bruce Levenstein from Cornell. And how do we know if we succeeded? I'm going to talk a little bit about works with Tzipora Raketson and Elad Segev. And asking, is science communication training effective, will be based on a work of Tzipora Raketson, but also works with Yael Bar-El-Ben-David and Erez Garti. Okay, let's start. So what are we trying to teach in science communication training? Why did we ask this question? Well, the rationale was to develop best practices and policy regarding science communication education. We actually need assessment. And in order to develop assessment, we need some learning goals. And in order to have some learning goals, we should have some kind of conceptualization of learning. So what does it mean to learn science communication? So what we did was we went to it was a work that we started 10 years ago. So we went to this report that was just published by the national academies in the US. It was called Learning Science in Informal Environments. And they had there 6 strands of what it means to learn science in informal environments. So we took these 6 strands and we tried to adapt them and say, okay, so what does it mean to learn science communication? So the 6 strands were first affective goal. So someone who learns science communication experiences excitement and interest and motivation about science communication. So that's, first of all, affective. Then we had a content goal. So someone who learns science communication comes to generate and understand and remember and use concepts that we taught them in science communication. The third is maybe the most obvious one. It has to do with methods and skills. So someone who learns science communication uses science communication methods, including written and oral and visual communication skills. The fourth one is less obvious. It's a reflective goal. So it's the idea that someone who learns science communication can reflect on science and on their role as science communicators within society, on the processes and the concepts and the institutions of science communication. I think it's something Sarah does all the time, for example, in her work. And the fifth goal is a participatory one. So the idea that someone who learns science communication actually practice science communication and do some training for themselves in authentic setting. And the last one, maybe the least familiar, but for me, very, very important, is the identity goal. So this is the idea of how people think about themselves. Do I think about myself as someone who does science communication? Okay, I guess you all know people or scientists that someone called them to give an interview, and although they had really interesting things to say and they actually speak very well, they said, I'm not that kind of person who gives an interview, go talk to someone else, right? So this is an identity issue. So do I see myself as someone who does science communication? Okay, so then we reviewed dozens and dozens of research articles describing science communication training for scientists. These were some of them. And what we did, we identified both explicit and implicit learning goals. So sometimes people said, what we meant to do was to teach X, but sometimes they didn't even say what they were meaning to teach, but we can implicitly understand from what they did and what they are telling us what they wanted to teach. So we classified these explicit and implicit learning goals into the conceptual definition, okay, the 6 goals that you saw before. So we identified areas of great attention, like content and methods. There were lots and lots of learning goals that had to do with content and method. And there were less attention to reflective and participation issues, and almost no attention at all to issues of the affective goals and identity goals of science communication training. Then we combined and rewarded items and added items where we thought they were missing, and made these 6 huge tables with lots and lots of learning goals. So these were the affective learning goals. And for example, for example, we want people who finish science communication training to think communication about science is important, for example. So the values they hold. Content knowledge learning goals were very, very many. For example, a person who learns science communication knows that good science communication requires multiple kinds of knowledge, and these are the different types and so forth. Also, the methods table was very, very long. For example, as skills for managing science communication projects. There were less about reflection learning goals, and even less about participation. So someone who learns science communication increases involvement in science communication events or participates in the network. And identity, really, we had to make up most of them. So someone who learns science communication feels confident and able to engage and identify oneself as a science communicator, and include science communication as a fundamental component of what they want to do, of who they are. Okay, so we have this really huge list, and of course, this is very useful in the sense that at least what we know what are the things that people want to teach, but it's not very useful if you want to actually teach it, because of course, no one course can do all of that. So that's why we then asked, how should we organize science communication training? So if we have all these goals, how should we organize them? And this, what I'm going to tell you now is really based on this paper that was published in the end of 2022, and the editors actually invite other people, all of you, I hope, to think about these issues and also reflect or give examples from your own experience. They would really like to publish future ideas about these issues. So I really encourage all of you to think about. Please ignore the March 2023, which is written here. Okay, so in this part, I'm asking teaching what, to whom, and in what order. So we wanted here to specify dependencies or paths through the various topics to systematically lead students to increasingly sophisticated, more nuanced levels of knowledge. We wanted to understand what learning objectives are reasonable for science communication at different levels. And in order to achieve that, we separated general topics, so cross-cutting concepts, which are relevant to all science communication, from really specific topics that we'll see in a moment that are relevant to a specific environment, for example. We also identified essential topics versus advanced topics. So let's start with the conceptual framework. I'm going to present 3 ideas, that of threshold concepts, learning progressions, and community of practice, and show you how we use these in order to think about how to organize science communication training. So threshold concepts is the idea of a transformative shift in students' understanding and appreciation of the field. Once a student understands the threshold concept, they can cross into more richer, more profound understanding. So within science education, for example, the concept of energy or ecosystem are used as a threshold concept. So we thought, okay, so what are the threshold concepts in science communication training? So what are the things that if you don't understand them, you can't move forward? And once you did understand them, then there's a whole new path in front of you. So of course, I'm just sharing here what we thought. Of course, you might think something else, and please write about it if you do. So the first one, the most basic one, was the idea of audience-centered communication. Communication must begin with audience analysis, and I think for many scientists who begin from a position of wanting to explain something, wanting to tell something, crossing this threshold really transitions them into an audience perspective. So the idea that it's not just about me and what I want to tell the world, but it's about what the audience might be wanting to hear. Then after you understand that, there's the idea of deficit model versus public engagement. So if the deficit model is really an intuitive belief that if I'll just give more information, people will change their attitudes and agree with me, after passing this threshold of accepting that it's insufficient, one can understand the value of alternative of public engagement. And this is a shift from understanding science communication simply as really a matter of information transfer to understanding it as a mutual relationship with an audience. So that's maybe the second threshold concept. Then we really want scientists to understand that values are fundamental part of science. So I'm coming for the Technion, and technological institution, and scientists and even engineers would tell you many times that their values are irrelevant to what they do. They do basic science, and then society can use it this way or the other, but what they do is completely objective. And really the idea that science carries within it a variety of social values is really not obvious to many of the people I'm talking with anyway. And once they understand that, they can accept this interdependency with society, and then can reflect about their own role, their own relationship with society, which brings us to the fourth concept, which is the concept of trust. And really trust emerges from competence and integrity and a belief in the benevolence of the communicator and transparency about the values. And I think when people understand that they should think about the audience, that information is not enough, that there are values in science as well, they are also ready to understand trust as something that they should care about and can care about. That it's something that is part of their role as communicators. So that was the first concept I wanted to introduce. The second conceptual framework we used was that of learning progressions. So learning progressions are hypothetical pathways of learning over a period of time that have been empirically validated. However, within science communication, we just don't have enough empirical evidence to have such path. So what we did, we really looked at it normatively. So we said, let's seek them, even if we don't have the empirical data. So learning progressions really encompass a spiral process in our case, in which specific topics, skills, and concepts may reoccur. So we learned about public engagement once, but it doesn't mean we can't visit it again in a more richer, deeper way. The third concept is that of community of practice. So we developed this framework by thinking of science communicators as a community of practice. And in a community of practice, one moves from legitimate peripheral participation to more central roles and positions. So if you think about our community as a sphere, let's say that a student is asked to show donors around the lab and explain what she's doing. So that's really the periphery of doing science communication. And let's say that what we are doing, which we're researchers or practitioners within science communication, that's a core activity within this community of practice. And what we want to do with training is actually help people move from the periphery into the core. They might not end up in the core, but that's another way of thinking about learning, moving with this sphere from the periphery into the core. Okay, so let's imagine that we have these three layers within a sphere. So the most peripheral one is the occasional science communicators. Then we have the active science communicators, and in the middle, there's the professional science communicators, which is, I would imagine, people who come to a seminar on Friday about science communication. So let's visit each one. So occasional science communicators are new or sporadic science communicators. For example, students new to doing outreach, or scientists that were not experienced with the media, but now have this paper in science and they have to be interviewed, or researchers at the institution asked to participate in an open day, and so forth. Occasional science communicators have a range of motivations. So why are they doing it? Some are fulfilling an obligation, others want to explore this, but they don't know much about it yet. Others have persuasion goals. They want I don't know, to persuade parents to vaccinate and so forth. So this is the periphery. Now, the active science communicators are individuals that have science communication as part of their active identity, but they also have other primary commitments. So that's not what is paying their salary in a way. For example, scientists who maintain a blog, okay? Or visible scientists, or someone that has an ongoing citizen science project in a school, and that kind of stuff. So these would be the active science communicators. And in the middle, at the core, we have professional science communicators. So people who consider science communication one of their major professional identities, and they devote significant professional time and also expect some monetary compensation for what they do. These might include museum staff, journalists, community organizers, researchers, and so forth. So again, what we want is to set different learning goals for different groups of learners based on their place within the community of practice. Because, of course, we don't want to think about the different groups in the same way when we are designing a learning progression. So what did we do? We began with the initial list of learning objectives, the big tables I showed you in the beginning. And we differentiated between learning objectives, which is what we want students to know in the end, purposes, which is what science communicators is trying to achieve, for example, persuasion, and motivation, so why communicators are choosing to communicate. Then we dropped items related to specific science communication context, like, I don't know, having a blog. And we assigned the objectives to each level of practice. So occasional would be the essential learning goals, and active and professional groups, that would be the advanced learning goals. Then we added topics that were underdeveloped in the 2017 paper, like digital content and ethics and reflective ideas and skills that has to do with communicating uncertainty. And then we did the most important thing, we gave it to other people. So we did a member check to test our reorganization, and our colleagues from different places in the world gave us very, very detailed feedback on everything that they thought wasn't in the right place. So we really spent some time working with this feedback that we received. So then what we did was really to think about what are the essential learning objectives for occasional communicators. So the people that are either new or just doing it sporadically, what is the thing that they need to know when they come to a training? And we can happily say that it wasn't such a big list. So we had a few affective issues, a few content knowledge, and a few methods, few reflection and participation and identity learning goals. But I think what you can see here, without reviewing all the list, is that it's manageable. So it's something that we can actually aspire to do in a few days of a workshop that has, I don't know, a few days or so. Then we looked at the advanced learning objectives. For active, that's on the left one, and the professional, the right column. And we also looked to see what are the advanced learning goals. And of course, this is a much longer list of affective, of content knowledge, of methods, as you can see. And of course, for the professionals, usually they have everything that the active ones have and a few more. For example, you can see here the advanced ones for participation and identity. But then we noticed that when we looked at the general ones, the cross-cutting ones, okay, we could do that. We could understand which is more essential and which is more advanced. The problem is that usually as science communication training people, we work at specific contexts. So I used to be a journalist, I would teach writing, I wouldn't teach necessarily video. Someone else who used to work as a I don't know, documentary person would probably put more emphasis on this. So the specific learning objectives for specific environments are really, really important. And when we looked at them, it was a completely different story. So while the tables list the general learning objectives, the specific science communication environment would really require developing specific competencies for each one, for production of media content, for interactions with journalists, for social media, for museums, for talks, for dialogical events, and so forth. Just to show you how different they are depending on the specific environment, we did this little trial. We looked at production of media content and interactions with journalists. And in purple, you see things that are relevant to production of media content, like knows publishing and distribution patterns to gain visibility, writes clearly to public media, produce videos, and so forth. And interactions with journalists have a completely different list of things one needs to know. For example, to feel comfortable interacting with the media, to know about news values and norms, and to have some camera practice. We just found one skill that was really essential for both. Has public speaking skills, knows how to develop and deliver a message. So it's really important to understand that for specific learning objectives, we need specific goals. So just one word about pedagogy, because I talked only about curriculum development in a way here. Just a word about pedagogy. So for the affective and reflective and identity strands, learning objectives can be more general and broad. So being reflective about your role as a science communicator, it's actually quite the same if you're talking on TV or you have a blog in a way. And the question rises, can we teach this content in an uncontextualized manner? So like talking to people theoretically about this without having a context of science communication. And I would say that the educational research literature and also practical experience would advise really against uncontextualized teaching. Learning is really influenced in fundamental ways from the context in which we teach. And transfer of learning, the ability to take what you learned in class, for example, and move it to another context. So the idea of far transfer can be facilitated by teaching in contexts that have elements that are similar or mirroring the real world context where they should actually put it into action. So just to give you an example, you remember the three groups: occasional communicators, active identity, and core professionals. And so these are maybe groups of saying how central science communication is to one's professional activity. So these are from the periphery to the core. And what you see here in blue is the level of authenticity of the transfer task. So we have down there simple task, and then simulated task, and then real task in the wild, something that is very similar to what you do in real life. And you can see that for each of these groups, you can come up with different levels of tasks. The authenticity of the task can be very different. So if I'm thinking about occasional communicator, to prepare a message box, that's a simple task. To be interviewed by a peer in the training course, that would be a simulation. But to be interviewed by a journalist or by even a student journalist from the other department, that would be a real task in the wild, okay? But if we go for, I don't know, core professionals, of course, we would choose different tasks. But again, we can start with a simple task like preparing an editorial calendar, have a simulation task like edit a class magazine, but also have a real task in the wild of editing a science news website. And of course, the transfer into real competency in real life would be better and higher if we go for real tasks in the wild in our training. Okay, so let's summarize what we did so far. We identified learning objectives that could support competency development, enabling learners to move from the periphery towards the core of the science communication community of practice. We identified essential versus advanced objectives and pointed to general cross-cutting objectives versus specific science communication environments. We identified a preliminary list of threshold concepts. And practically, I hope we contributed to program developers and science communication trainers. We hope it will further evolve and be developed to include specific learning objectives for various science communication environments. Now, theoretically, I hope this is a stepping stone to future development of a learning progression for learners of science communication that can help structure a science communication curriculum of training programs. Now, I know that for many of us, when we hear about curriculum, it gets people annoyed because they think about their own context and that they know better their own context, and standardization has its problems, which is all true. But I do think that science communication practice and training has a major issue of reinventing the wheel all the time. And I think having a curriculum or some kind of curriculum would help people start from something instead of starting from the first floor. You can take a curriculum and adapt it or choose whatever you want and in a way that is relevant to what you're doing. Okay, so just reminding you this. So how do we know if we succeeded? I've been working on assessment of science communication training for some time, but I want to share with you just two cool technology enhanced teaching and assessment tools because they're free and maybe you want to use them. So the first one has to do with jargon. So within this idea of teaching methods, we have the idea of the learning goal of crafting messages suitable for specific audiences. And that entails making messages and complex ideas understandable to a range of audiences. And that usually has avoiding jargon in it. And avoiding jargon is difficult for scientists due to the course of knowledge and challenges of genre shift. We know that academic and scientific texts may have as much as 22% jargon and are becoming worse actually with years. Readers need to be familiar with 98% of the words in text to be for comprehension. Now, this is a bit simplistic, but let's say that if it's more than 1 in 50 words that we don't understand, that's starting to be a problem, okay? I'm not saying that this is the number and we should always stick to it. And the question was, how can jargon be identified? So usually people used closed lists. We tried once to use Google News hits as a kind of a benchmark. We tried to rank professional versus general corpus of texts. And then we came up with the jargonizer. So the idea is that the jargonizer identifies vocabulary as high frequency, mid frequency, or potential jargon. So it's the red ones you want to avoid. And it can be used by educators like us in assessment of science communication training programs, and can also aid researchers themselves in testing the text that they have. We used, when we developed it, 250,000 articles from the BBC with over 90 million words and 500,000 different words. And after 5 pilot stages, that it's good that we have PhD students in our lives, we arrived at good agreement with results from other studies on jargon and word frequency. And the jargonizer came to be in, I think, 2015. Today it looks like this. And basically, it's a really, really simple tool. What it does, it counts words and looks at how frequent they are during a certain 3 years. So in this case, 2018 to 2021. And then you just paste your article or your text, and it colors the different words and tells you, maybe you should look at this. So if this is an abstract from the Bulletin of the American Physical Society, for example, you can see that there's 9% rare words. So these are words that people are advised to look at and maybe change some of them. And if you look at news item about the same paper that was in the New York Times, you can see that, well, this one had 9% words, this one had 3%. So of course, it's not a smart system. It's just a system that allows you to see what are the words that you should pay attention to. And then we said, once ChatGPT came into our lives a few months ago, we said, okay, so maybe we can give people, all these people who visit, instead of just giving them the jargonizer, we can also give them some kind of other feedback, like personalized feedback, which we did. So we took the half-life idea of, maybe you know it, it's a very nice training that you do in science communication training to get people to distill their message. And we really tell them, okay, so tell us what you do in, let's say, 120 words. And then people say what they do, and it gives them two kinds of feedback. It gives them the feedback of what are the words that maybe people wouldn't know, which is the same as the jargonizer, but it also tells them how ChatGPT would have written this for a 9-year-old, I think, and give them that kind of blurbs that they can use. Is it effective? We're actually currently not collecting the data, but analyzing. I should have about analyzing the data. It actually seems that the jargonizer helps more than the ChatGPT, because it allows people to do it for themselves, not just give them a text. But we should look at this more carefully. And the issue is that assessment tools are not enough. In order to really assess performance, we need a benchmark for what constitutes good science communication practice, because you need to measure it versus something. And for example, many programs teach scientists how to work more effectively with media, but we don't have a standard of what it means to be interviewed well, for example, or producing a good press release. What does it mean? We never said what is expected, okay, in a way. So although many science communication and trainers have their own subjective judgment about what constitutes good practice, we don't know what the minimal standard that all trainers could agree on. And I'm wondering if we could ever have a minimal standard that we could all agree on. Okay, so that brings me to the next question of, is science communication training effective? So I'm going to show just two examples. One from an academic writing course that had science communication incorporated into it. And the second is an on-the-job training option. Okay, so the research question here was, what is the effect of a short science communication intervention, so one lesson in a course, embedded in academic writing course on graduate STEM students writing in academic and popular science genres, both at the text structure level and the use of jargon? And the second question is there interference between these two genres when they are taught together? Because when we wanted to persuade the university to give science communication training, they said, but it might hurt the ability of the graduate students to learn academic writing. And so we don't want to hurt that. So that's what we asked. And what you see here, let's start with the control. Do you see the control? So these are the people that didn't have any intervention. And as you can see, there's no change, basically, in not in the writing academic abstract and not in writing popular abstract. This is the comparison group that just had the academic course without the science communication intervention. And you can see that there's an improvement in the academic genre, but almost no improvement in the popular genre. And these two groups, they actually received a one lesson science communication intervention within this academic writing course. And you can see that in both cases, there's improvement, a great improvement, both in writing academic abstract and in writing popular abstract. And the graduate students did use less jargon when writing for general audiences. So these are the general audiences. And sorry, I jumped too quickly. So what you see here is the improvement in writing skills that has to do with genre, structure, and style. So people were better at using the right style, for example, in popular science, using a title, inverted pyramid, use of active voice, the 6 WH questions, definitions, explanations, and so forth. And then we asked, what happened to the jargon? So you can see that the graduate students actually use less jargon when writing popular text than writing academic text. But still, it wasn't nearly enough to be understood. An average of 10% jargon in academic text versus an average of 6% average of jargon in popular science text. Now, this really far exceeds any recommendation, of course. Now, let's ask, does it interfere? So if you teach someone popular writing, will it interfere with academic writing? And you see two things. The bad one is that the results did not demonstrate improvement in jargon use among intervention groups. So this is, for example, the intervention group. This is pre-intervention, 5.4% jargon, and this is post-intervention, almost 6. So we didn't see that teaching them a lesson about science communication helped at all to use less jargon. But the results did not demonstrate interference for learning academic and popular science genres together either. So this is the intervention group, and you can see that nothing bad happened to the academic writing with regard to jargon. So was the science communication intervention effective? In the case of a short one-lesson science communication intervention focused on writing popular text, we see that some popular writing skills, like using explanations and journalistic text, actually improved, but students did not show any improvement in avoiding jargon. But we also didn't find any interference. So teaching popular science writing to advanced postgraduate students does not disadvantage their academic writing. So from this, we learned that adding the popular science genre does not hinder academic writing learning. And if goals are set realistically, students can improve even from one short intervention. And we also saw that tools for identifying and adjusting jargon use may prove practical for teaching and assessing of non-expert public writing. Okay, I'm gonna finish with one more example, and that is for on-the-job training. We asked, can scientists fill the science journalism void? We looked at online public engagement with science stories authored by scientists. So basically this idea that we don't have enough science journalists, and maybe scientists should be communicating science themselves in the media. And we asked, okay, but when publishing on the same platform, is there a difference in public engagement with science items written by scientists and written by journalists? So what we did, we looked at the on-the-job science communication training of David Institute of Science Education. They had a reporters program of graduate science students who contributed popular science stories that were edited by journalistic staff. So what we did, we took items that were written by this science students, so they are all graduate science students, and we coupled them, we paired them with another item that was published in the same channel, on the same website, on the same date. For example, you see here, this is in the animals section of Vienna, which is a very highly read website, news website. And you can see they are both on the animal section. And the only difference is here, this is the journalist writing, and this is Dr. Yonat Eschar from the Weizmann Institute, from the Davidson Institute, writing it. Or for example, this is for the tourism and vacation travel channel of Mako. And you have here someone from a journalist, and here you have a student writing about science. And we looked at the views, the likes, the commenting, and the time on page that these different items got. And this is the answer. So is on-the-job science communication training effective? I don't know if it's effective, but scientists who received training engaged the audience to a similar level. So there was no significant difference in the number of views, in the average time on page, in the likes, in the comments in Ynet, and no significant difference in the other website, not in the average time on page and not in the comments. So I think I will stop here, because I want to have some time for your questions. I just want to say that if you would like, and if you have the time, I would love to present also a freely available resource that we have, a science communication MOOC on edX that people might want to use in their own teaching.
Thanks so much, Ayelet. I'm just finding the clap icon. Yeah, thank you for such a rich presentation. We have indeed 15 minutes for comments and questions. You can either put them in the chat or you can raise your hand and ask something. I would actually I have many questions or many reflections. One thing that I was thinking about is the notion of communities of practice, or a community of practice. And it struck me as you were talking, I mean, one of the challenges, I think, of science communication practice relates to the fact that there are indeed multiple communities of practice that are not always talking to each other or engaged with each other. So I just wondered how that fitted into this, these models for training, and whether you just discussed that at all.
We didn't discuss it. I would imagine that the different communities have to do with different specific contexts. So if you have a community of practice that does citizen science, they of course naturally hate the ones who do community science because it's not really science, and the community science would of course think bad things about citizen science people who do not really feel the community. So this is something we all know. I mean, we all like our own groups and explaining ourselves why our group is much better than the other group. This is like a human thing. But I think this has to do with specific context. And I think there are things that we want to teach in general, and it's useful to generally think about what are the things we need to do, teach people to allow them to maybe get in touch with the core or get inside. And each community would of course have its own learning goals that are more, how would they say, more central and more important, and the ones that are less important. So I agree with you that you move into the core in a specific space, not in the global science community of practice sense.
Thanks. Sophie, I don't know if you're, yeah.
I think I have a question. Thank you so much for your presentation. So I have a question as a non-education specialist. So I'm come from political communication. And what struck me, and I thought that your research on use of jargon was really interesting, and also then paired with this question that you need like specific goals and everything. I was wondering, how do experts in science communication and educational training kind of define this idea? And you said it yourself, it's not quite clear what is good science communication, right? But it seems to me that the underlying goal or assumption here is always this idea of comprehension and learning, right? So comprehension, people should be able to learn, right? That's like probably one of the goals of education, I guess. They should comprehend what science is about, and therefore the next logical step would be this to kind of remove, for example, incomprehensible jargon. But I wonder if the removal of jargon could not have like unintended other effects, because one of the kind of, I would think one of the goals of science communication is also to establish, for example, trust, or to establish perceptions of competency, for example. And whether you've also explored that, because you would think that if you kind of remove the kind of scientific language and the kind of things that identify that kind of the things that make science language different from normal language, you also remove competency expectations, right? So people think, okay, this is just normal stuff. And we have this all the time in political communication, where we think, okay, if we can only break it down, if we can only make it comprehensible, then people will like politics and people will want politics. But then, or if we make a game out of it, where they will realize that disinformation is a problem. But the problem is that if we make it too normal, people don't take it seriously anymore.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with that kind of discrepancy between breaking things down and making it still look like expert knowledge?
Yeah, that's a fabulous question. So I'll just start by addressing the first part of what he said. I think different people have different primary goals for science communications. Of course, many times for people coming from education background like me, or journalistic background like me again, have really, for them, it might be really, really important that people would understand, people would have the knowledge, people would have the ability to make decisions, people would have access to the knowledge they need in order to make informed decisions and so forth. Other people have other goals. So I think many people have the goals of involvement and engagement higher in their hierarchy. So I know people who care more about the engagement and the communication process than on the science being there at all, or whose science is it, and so forth. So it's not like clear cut that it's about comprehension. Having said that, once we want comprehension, the tension you mentioned is completely there. The idea, I think Rainer Bromme from Germany is working on, and his students work a lot about this idea of, how does he say it, scientificness, and how scientificness on one, how would I say it, gives away this idea, this notion of competency, and how much it affects trust or not. Exactly. And I think one of two types of empirical data that I saw really speak to this problem. So far, one, I think it's a paper by him, I'm almost sure, that he showed that when the text is too easy or too comprehensible, then people just assume they understand more than they actually do. So the readers would say, yeah, sure, of course, and they feel very well about themselves and feel very confident in their decision, although they don't know. So it's more like an illusion of knowing, which is sometimes more dangerous than realizing you just don't know. And the second is that when we interviewed, one of my PhD students were interviewing female scientists, and they said, I can't do what you told me to lose the jargon, because people don't take me seriously as is, as a female scientist. If I don't use jargon, they would definitely not take me seriously. They wouldn't even consider me an expert. So the language, the vocabulary helps her to establish the white coat, the listen to me type of thing that she needs. Now you asked how to deal with it, and the answer is, of course, I don't know. Let's start by being aware of the problem, like you are. And I would say that establishing the white coat in a different way, or establishing it in the beginning, showing off in a way that you are able to speak the language, the proper language, and then move to talking in a human way, or using other indicators of your expertise, so you don't have to use jargon that people don't understand, because we do know that jargon also gives the people the impression that this is not for them, that it's for someone else, and they just lose attention.
Thank you so much. But it also seems that this is really important to establish these benchmarks, like what is too much jargon and what is not enough, because you're moving also into this direction of like establishing smart tools people can use, right? Mm-hmm. So then you need these benchmarks because you need to quantify it somehow, say, okay, 6% jargon is okay and 3% is little. And so where do these benchmarks come from if you want to have these smart jargon moving communication tools?
That's a really good question. So I can tell you.
I mean, I don't expect you to have an answer, but that's something I'm asking myself as well for these, because these tools are used in all sorts of other forms, in journalism, in politics, everywhere. Well, how do we make these smart tools when we don't even know what good communication is?
Yeah, I don't know about German. I would guess you have much more information that we have, but we did it it wasn't that hard to do it in English because there's so much information in English, both empirical and conceptual about what people need to know, expected to know, and so forth. So we were able to use what is known and what we have and somehow find the benchmarks ourselves, which made sense. In a way, this tool makes sense, but in Hebrew, it doesn't make sense. Because in Hebrew, we don't have enough external data to tell us what the benchmarks are. And also Hebrew, I would imagine, like German, is far more complicated language to begin with. So the different ways the words are constructed is not something that easily lends itself to this. So I think, in a way, my pessimistic idea here is, again, English would be richer, would have more tools, and we don't.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Barbara.
Yeah, thanks. I'm wondering, a lot of the examples that you had were from media communication and journalism. Are there any studies on the effectiveness of science communication training which focuses more on science engagement and more dialogical participatory forms?
I give examples of things I did, so that's the ones I know. I know of an example. It's not about engagement, but there were two American groups that came up with completely opposite results. What they did, they gave some training to scientists. I don't remember if it was graduate students or active scientists, and they took a little video of them explaining about what they do before the training and after. And then they showed these videos. I don't remember, it was experts who didn't know if it was pre or post, or it was just general audience. It was really, really small numbers, okay? But one of them showed that there was an improvement. So people found it more comprehensible, but the people also more trustworthy and wanted to know more and so forth after they watched the video from after the intervention, and the other didn't. The other didn't find anything. Basically, it doesn't answer your question, because you asked about engagement. I'm just telling you everything I know empirically. I think what most people are doing and are very surprisingly happy with themselves doing so is just giving attitude scales and self-assessment scales. So they can show that before the intervention, people thought, I don't know, that the audience was stupid and there's no use in talking to it. And then after the intervention, they say they want to have dialogue all day. But I don't think it was actually measured not using self-assessment. I'll be happy to hear about anything if you know.
So we are almost out of time. Maybe, though, I would ask one final question, which unfortunately I think is not an easy question, but maybe relates a bit to what Barbara was just asking about. I really like this notion of threshold concepts and the 4 things that you identify as kind of key ideas for people to proceed in learning about science communication. It struck me, again, relating to this issue, that there is no clear consensus about what is good science communication, that perhaps those might be contested. And I was especially thinking of that in relation to this kind of understanding of the deficit model and dialogue and participation and public engagement, because you presented that as a kind of an understanding of the value of engagement as a threshold concept that would allow learners to be, to develop and to become more sophisticated. I, of course, agree with that, because these ideas of dialogue kind of very much mesh with science and technology studies work on science communication. But it seems to me that this in particular may well not be a kind of consensus view, that some people would argue for the value of one-way forms of communication, of persuasion, of these kinds of things. So I just wondered, again, how you had discussed or thought about the contested nature of some of these concepts.
we didn't. We just said, in a way, we know that this is ours. We know that other people would have different ideas on the, if we would like, on the right, we would have the people of persuasion and accuracy, and they would have their own ideas. And on the left, we would have people who think that we should lose the power, or not lose, but give away some of the power, the epistemic power that science demands in a way for itself, for other types of knowledge and other types of knowers. And I would imagine that each group would have its own key ideas.
In this respect, I have to say I am very much looking forward to the responses in the it's International Journal of Science Education, right? Your paper is in. And so are they still accepting submissions and comments?
Yeah, actually they did. So the reason it says March 2023 is that it's a boring story, but they thought it would be published earlier and it didn't. So that's why they're still accepting. And I think they're looking forward for debates and arguments.
Yeah, so if anyone here or listening to the YouTube video wants to contribute, that would be great. Otherwise, yeah, I look forward to that discussion in the journal. Thank you so much, Ayelet, again, for this really, really rich presentation. I think it's given us all a lot of resources and things to think about in our teaching. So thank you for your time. And yeah, all the best for the afternoon.
Thank you very much, and thank you for listening.